Welcome to the Far and Beyond podcast, hosted by the Contracts and Fiscal Law Department at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. The podcast where we navigate the ever-shifting landscape of federal procurement and fiscal law. I'm Major Ellie Sewell.
And I'm Lieutenant Colonel Alana Hines.
And I'm Lieutenant Colonel Andy Scott.
And today we are going to talk about research, contract research. There's been a lot of change in the last year, I would say, in the contract world. And we thought it would be a good idea to sit down and talk about all the different ways or areas where to find information right now, because it really does seem like everything is changing so quickly.
For sure, it's definitely evolving. And I think probably where most people start when they're tackling a contract law research issue is looking at the federal acquisition regulation, right? And you'd find that at acquisition.gov. But one of the things that you were mentioning, Ellie, is the fact that things have been moving around. So acquisition.gov historically has been where you would look for both the federal acquisition regulation and any relevant agency supplement. Right now, if you're navigating to acquisition.gov based on the Revolutionary FAR Overhaul, you're going to want to orient yourself to the section of acquisition.gov that's specifically labeled for the FAR Overhaul. And within that section, it has a quick access table of contents.
Yes.
and I find that helpful, but just to kind of briefly touch on what some of those things are. So one of those is the RFO parts and as well as deviations. And so that's where you'll actually find the text of the current, in particular, if your agency has adopted via deviation.
Yeah, so if you look at the FAR parts, you'll see a number that says how many agencies have deviated. You can click on it and they'll have the list. So you can just double check if you're not sure about your specific agency, if you're following that FAR overhaul section or not.
And then it also has two things that I've found very helpful as I've tried to make sure I'm familiarizing myself with changes and updates. And those are the practitioner albums and the FAR companion. So
Yes.
Practitioner albums, Ellie, what do you like about those?
I go into these first. Whenever I'm going into a section that I haven't looked at before or it's just newer to me, I open up the FAR overhaul, and then on the right-hand side, you will see practitioner album. I will click on that link and it does a summary change, and it will tell me what has been deleted, what has changed, what's been added, if anything really has changed. Sometimes it just says the wording has changed for clarity and reorganization. And then I know that the law hasn't changed. They've just made it clear. And then you can scroll down and it specifically tells you what sections have been deleted, what have been added, and what have been actually moved to the FAR companion or PGI guides. So it's very clear.
And what's your level of fidelity with that source? Do you think it's updated as of today? Would you still want to check other sources to confirm that summary is accurate?
I would still check it. They have been pretty clear if there have been updates. It's usually in red text right underneath if there has been some update to that section. And we have seen them in March. There were a couple that went out, some updates on those deviations.
But let's zoom back for a minute here, because the updates that you're clicking on that link for are really just in the federal acquisition regulation, right? But there are all these supplements that we know about.
Oh, yeah.
And as Alana was saying earlier, that's traditionally where you would go to look at all of your supplement information. If you've got the main site in the FAR, but if you work, for example, for the Department of the Army, you would want to go to the AFARS. Now, under normal circumstances, and perhaps, in a year or two, if you're listening to this, in 2027 or 2028, it may again be the case that the place you want to look is on acquisition.gov, and the AFARS will be updated, and there's a great comparison tool that you can use to compare different provisions, see how they nest together, and that capability is still there. The problem is the interactive website, which is acquisition.gov. It's actually pretty user-friendly. The updates haven't made it below the FAR level yet. And so for the agency supplements, how are we thinking through this? I can look up, let's say I'm a contract law attorney for the Army. I can find the FAR information pretty easily on acquisition.gov. What am I going to do to find the AFARS?
So for the AFARS right now, if you're a DOW employee, or specifically if you're a Department of Army, you would go to procurement.army.mil, PAM, not to be confused with a Department of Army pamphlet. But that is where the current live updated AFARS resides. And I will recommend that site as well, not just for that, but, we talk about primary source, but also that's where templates, including, required templates, but even suggested templates, which I always find very helpful, both to advise our clients and our acquisitions professionals to use, but also so you could familiarize yourself as a new contract law attorney. The PGI is also there. And there is also a public-facing version of that available, because obviously we want to make sure the broad public can access the AFARS if they need to. But if you are a contract attorney and you're working for the Army, procurement.army.mil would be the best place for you to go to get the most up-to-date version of the AFARS and the PGI.
I think that's absolutely right. We've looked through a bunch of different agencies. Obviously, we can't represent every government agency. They are not all uniformly going through the practice of putting them out both publicly and on an intranet that requires some kind of login. I imagine eventually that will happen, but you're going to have to talk to your colleagues and your agency about where the updates for your agency for any FAR supplemental are being published. It may be that your agency is pushing them out in emails, but hopefully they're listing them somewhere. That's going to be really important as you do your research. I will note, you can, in many cases, including for the Army, including for the Air Force, you can navigate to these updates through acquisition.gov. If you click on, for example, the AFAR tab, there is a link to knowledge management, and that takes you to procurement.army.mil. You can also do this with the DFARS. If you click on the Air Force supplement, you actually have to click down into the chapter that you're looking at, and at the very top, you'll see a link to knowledge management. And then there's a credential pop-up. That's behind a security wall. Yeah. You can use acquisition.gov. If you
starting points.
Yeah, if you can't remember where else to look, I think the takeaway, we're recording this in July of 2026. For at least the next 6 months or potentially a year or longer, there are going to be updates published to these supplements that aren't yet on the website itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that note, for the DFARS, so for the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, as well as the related procedures, guidance, and information, or PGIs as we refer to them, DPCAP, which is the Defense Pricing, Contracting, and Acquisition Policy site, is where you'll find those updates. And we'll make sure that these links that we're referencing are in the show notes.
I'm writing them down in order. They will all be in the show notes. Do not worry. You can go there and find all the links to everything we talk about today. Yeah,
and unfortunately, for example, on DPCAP, you're just going to be downloading a PDF, right? Mm-hmm. It's not interactive and user-friendly in the way that...
Control F. That's all you need.
Exactly. If you've got Control F, you're well on your way.
And kind of circling back to one of those points on how frequently are these things updated, I will say, like the red that Ellie mentioned, I was researching something for contract types, and it had a July note in there, both within the appropriate portion of the RFO, but also in the practitioner album. So that is super helpful. And you mentioned when you were discussing the utility of practitioner albums, the FAR Companion. That document
is a PDF.
Yeah.
It is one PDF. So you download one PDF for the entire RFO FAR. It goes through all of them, part 1 all the way to part 52. So you just have one. And yes, a lot of information has been moved there. Think market research. So much of the market research is now in the FAR Companion. So it is really important when you're doing any research and you're looking something up, double check the FAR Companion to see if any procedures, any other tidbits have been actually moved there. And most sections have something in there. Some of them are short, some of them are long. So just double check the FAR Companion. Again, you can find the link right underneath the practitioner album on that RFO FAR page.
Are we aware of whether class deviations are still current and updated or are we going to have to look at our agency supplemental on those outside websites to make sure that the class deviations are captured in our research?
So as of what I've been understanding is that they are updating for the FAR specifically those deviations as soon as things happen for the RFO.
So for the Department of War, or it'll still say Defense when we're talking DP cap, right? So on that website, there is a specific class deviation section,
Yes.
and I would recommend, even though the RFO FAR section of acquisition.gov does reference different deviations per FAR section, there are class deviations, as Ellie mentioned, that may not necessarily be specific to a particular FAR section. So on that note, I would recommend that you're also routinely referencing the class deviations, both for if you're within the Department of War, that you're looking at the ones on DP cap or your other agency sites.
Class deviations are typically for a quick change in policy. We're going through a lot of changes in policy,
Yes.
Mostly related to statutory changes, but there may be cases even still where class deviations need to be issued as interim guidance before the final new rule is published.
And then right now, normally, you can look at the FAR and you're like, okay, probably good. But right now, double check and make sure those deviations aren't changing, just because we are going through notice and comment right now. So things may be changing quickly, and especially in the next few months as the notice and comment gets adjudicated. There's probably going to be more deviations and more updates to those deviations.
Yeah.
And we know that we may start in the FAR and look at a FAR part, and within that FAR part, it references a statute, which leads me to, where do we go then? What should be our next step?
Well, I mean, I think it's always important to look at the law, right? When you're doing legal research, you're doing legal research, even if it's for government contracts. Understanding the FAR is going to give you probably most of the answers that you want, but sometimes there are incorporations by reference to statutory provisions. I'll give you an example. The Davis-Bacon Act, which sets certain rules for competition in contracting for services where, for example, in service contracts or construction contracts above a certain threshold, you need to establish wage rates for labor under those contracts. Now, those wage rates are not going to be found anywhere in the FAR. You need to look outside the FAR. You'll probably need to look into the U.S. Code to find out what the guidance is there. And so that's just one example of where you have to link back to the U.S. Code or the public laws. And so where do you go for that? Well, there are many websites that maintain the U.S. Code. I tend to use the house.gov one that's published by the House of Representatives. It is as current as any other one. There's also a U.S. Code maintained by Cornell University that seems to be pretty good. Those are two places to look, but also not every law is incorporated into the U.S. Code. You may need to look into the public laws of the United States, and that can be a very daunting task because you may not know where to look. For a military audience, most all policy related to contracting is going to be promulgated in the National Defense Authorization Act.
I was just going to say your PLs for like P.L, which is your public law.
That's right.
It's probably referencing back to an NDAA.
It's exactly. So if you see a PL reference and there's not a U.S. Code reference, that means there's something about this policy that is not codified yet in the U.S. Code. Maybe it's a temporary authority or a limited authority, or for whatever reason, the drafters of the NDAA did not want to put it in the permanent U.S. Code, or the committee that revises the U.S. Code just hasn't gotten around to it. I would say if you want to look at NDAAs, you can look them up on congress.gov. Congress.gov is a bit of a clunky tool if you're looking for something specific because it has an incredible volume of information. My recommendation is if you're just looking for National Defense Authorization Acts, you're going to want to go to, it still says Department of Defense, but it's the Department of War's History and Library Directorate. That will take you to a link for DoD authorization and appropriation laws for the past many decades, right? And so you can click on a year, and not only will it give you the final past version, but you can also look up other versions of this law that didn't make it into the law. Now, why would we care about versions of this bill that didn't make it into the law? Well, occasionally you really have questions about legislative intent or where this came from, because it could inform your interpretation of this law. And so what you can do at, again, the Department of War's History and Library Directorate is you can look up the Senate passed version of a bill, the House passed version of a bill, and the final version of the bill. You can also look at the committee reports and the conference report, or the joint explanatory statement, which is the same thing as a conference report. It just has to do with the mechanism by which the law is passed. It's a technical thing, but in any given year, an NDAA, a final published law, passed law, will either have a conference report or a joint explanatory statement. And a lot of the meat that you're going to get in terms of congressional intent is going to be in the committee reports, right? The House report or the Senate report. So if you see a provision in the NDAA, let's say from the 2025 NDAA, and you're reading this provision and you're thinking, okay, I think I understand what's going on here. I'm not really sure what the intent of this is. The report entry in the conference report or the joint explanatory statement is probably not going to say much. It's probably going to say the House had this in their bill, the Senate had no similar provision, the conference committee agrees to adopt the House provision. What that's telling you is you need to go look up the House committee report, right? The House Committee on Armed Services. If you pull the committee passed version from that year and look into that report, there's likely to be an extensive report entry that explains the provision and what the congressional intent is, right? Now, this is deep research. This is deep background. And you may not need this in most cases, but there might be times when you're working on a project to try to understand kind of what's going on. These resources can be really helpful.
Yeah, in the fiscal law arena, when there were recent updates to Combatant Command Experimentation Authority, I remember peeling back the onion to look at what the different versions were was helpful in understanding some of the intent there. So for sure. And I know we've talked quite a bit now on the primary sources, but what about secondary sources for contract research? What kinds of suggestions do you guys have on that?
Well, I want to mention one more primary source before we move to secondary sources, and that is case law, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Case law is primary source, and, the GAO has a website where they publish their opinions. The United States Court of Federal Claims has a website where they publish their opinions, and the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals has a site where they publish their opinions. And I believe other government agencies also have boards of contract appeals. I haven't worked in those agencies, but I would look to find, because those published opinions can be dispositive. You can really treat them like case law in many examples.
I will say GAO's website can be a little clunky when you're trying to find a specific case. I don't know what it is, but when you search for the specific B number, sometimes it's not going to pull up that case, but only where that case has been cited to, which can be an issue if it's a very relevant or new case. So looking at Lexis or Westlaw might be a better option. Sometimes I've just Googled it and it's popped up, and that's gotten me to the link at GAO. So if you're struggling that way, maybe go work around going either through LexisNexis or Westlaw, or just Google it and see if you can then get to that case, and make sure you have the most recent case, because some of these cases can drag on for years and they have multiple B numbers. But that would be my tip for GAO cases.
Yeah, I've definitely known that a case existed, but then not been able to locate it on the website, but Google found it for me. So,
and it's funny because you try and search the actual company's name then, and then 10 cases will pop up, and I'm like, how many times have they filed a protest? You have to be careful.
I do think that's great advice. Sometimes all you need is the GAO website if you know you're just looking for one opinion. Mm-hmm. But usually with legal research, we don't necessarily know what we don't know, and that's where those research engines like Lexis and Westlaw can be really helpful, because not only are they going to pull you the right authority, but they're also going to tell you if there's contradictory authority. They're going to be updated. Not everyone has access to that all the time, and the information is out there on the court websites and on the GAO. It just takes a little more work. But there are also people out there that are keeping everyone updated by compiling information and publishing updates. So I just wanted to hit on a few. This is no government endorsement. This is no recommendation. There are some websites that I use that could be helpful. But again, there's no federal endorsement implied here. But WIFCON can be a very helpful website because it will show you all of the open FAR cases. It will give you updates on litigation. It also has articles published by leading practitioners in law firms, which can be very, very helpful. And so I think WIFCON is a really solid research tool in terms of getting an idea of, how the FAR is being updated and what cases are working through the system right now.
Yeah, for sure. When I'm preparing for classes that I'm teaching, I'm using some of these secondary sources to help direct me to updates, especially. You can go on GAO or ASPCA and look for recent cases, but it's not necessarily going to categorize it by topic area. So knowing that there's been a change in how we're applying standards to a particular area, like differing site conditions, just using that as an example, not saying there's been a change, but can be helpful when you're tackling a particular issue.
Yeah, and if you're looking at small business issues, I would say another site that can be very helpful is smallgovcon.com. And again, they publish essentially weekly updates of developments in law for small government contractors.
There's been a few changes that have happened over the last few years with small businesses, especially stuff coming out of the NDAA. So that's not a bad thing to look up, especially if you're entering into just another small business contract that maybe you just want to make sure you're doing everything correct.
Yeah, and another compiler of decisions is stanhinton.com. And Stan Hinton is pretty good at keeping up with developments in government contracting. They publish annual federal procurement reviews, and you can look at those historically, right? So it can be a useful research. If you're dealing with a contract that is older, you can look and see sort of what the law was at the time and how it might have changed since then. And also, in addition to these annual reports, Stan Hinton is constantly updating developments in government contracting, and it's not at all unusual to see updates on that page daily or multiple times a week. Don't know Stan Hinton. The
website was helpful though.
Yeah, and there are more out there, right?
Yes.
These are just some that we have used. These are just some that we have used.
And you mentioned Westlaw and LexisNexis. What are some uses for those beyond finding case law?
One of the things that I like to use Lexis for is for academic research. And so if you really need to get into the nuts and bolts of a case to try to understand what the theory of the law is, if you're having trouble applying a provision, Lexis and Westlaw both have deep databases of academic publishing on government contract law. And so if you find an article that explains in depth, especially like a primer, right, which is also something we do really well here at the Judge Advocate School. We have the Military Law Review and the Army Lawyer. Those are great sources. Those are available on Westlaw and Lexis. But those are great sources too, because not only do they publish academic articles about, suggestions for future changes, especially the Army Lawyer, it will just publish an overview, a primer on a legal issue. And so those are on Westlaw and Lexis. Those are also available through the JAGCOR website.
Nash and Sabinic also have the briefing papers. So those have been helpful because they'll talk about pretty briefly, but about hot topics that are happening right now. And those are helpful too, as you're trying to maybe something's going on immediately and new NDAAs come out or something, the FAR changing. So those have been helpful as well.
And those are accessible on Westlaw.
Yes.
And speaking of Nash and Sabinic, and again, I know we're saying we've said multiple times no endorsement, but if you are a book person and you want to read either a hard copy or digital book, those are a very common source of information on the formation and administration of
like a horn book style. Yeah,
for sure. And updated quite regularly. So, make sure that you're at the current version. I think we're on perhaps 6 now.
5 or 6.
Yeah, I think so. But those are an excellent resource in terms of just covering by topic area various portions of formation and administration of government contract.
And I'd say there's one more source that's very close to home that we might want to point folks to.
And what is that?
Of course, it's the Contract Attorney's Deskbook, which is published by our department, the Department of Contract and Fiscal Law, and it is updated annually. So it usually, when does the update get published? Summer?
So we just published one, and actually it's a little different this year. So it shifted title. It has historically for many, many iterations been the Contract Attorney's Deskbook, but we titled it the Acquisition Attorney's Deskbook in 2026 just to account for the fact that we now have sections in there that are talking about other than FAR-based contracts. So we switched it up a little bit. But the most recent one came out in July of this year, so you can find that on our website, and we do update that annually. And we also included a link this year where if there's anything that you wish you saw in there, or anything that you recommend as either an addition, an update, an edit, you have a direct link that you can provide us that information, because we really do want to make sure that this resource is
up to date
and helpful for the general public.
Well, that's breaking news on the Acquisition Attorney's Deskbook. I'm sure I'm going to get that wrong many times going forward. I will say this really can be the first place you look if you're just trying to get information. Obviously, this desk book is not going to, just like the other secondary sources, it's not going to be something you're citing in a memo. You won't be telling a judge, well, the acquisition attorney's desk book told me this, but it is a really great place to get you started. And we do our best to give you the citations you need within the desk book to go to the primary source.
Yes, whether it's case law or the FAR or a statute, we really do try and cite to everything so that way you know where to go next. It's a good starting point.
And we know that contracts law sometimes goes hand in hand with fiscal law in terms of if you're researching a contract law issue, you may also find yourself in need of diving into some fiscal law. So as well as having the Acquisition Attorney Deskbook, we also have a Fiscal Law Deskbook, and we have fiscal law research and contract law research classes available. If you locate those on our website, we have a section where we have recorded videos and presentations. So if this was not enough for you, there is more out there.
So much more.
Yeah, contract and fiscal law are inextricably linked, even though they're very different bodies of law. If you have fiscal law, you're buying something with that money. And if you have contract law, you have to get money from somewhere. So I think that it's a great idea as an acquisitions attorney to make sure that you're up to date on fiscal law. Oftentimes, contracts can fail under review because of an issue related to fiscal law. I think there's one more topic we should cover simply because it's 2026, and that is the use of AI in research. So have you all found AI to be beneficial in doing your research, and in what way?
The most beneficial way I've used AI is when I take sources and put it into some kind of closed AI resource. So whether that's Notebook LM or Gen AI.
Do you want to explain, just like we're talking to our dads, what is open AI and what is closed AI?
So like open AI is where you go into like Google or Gemini and you just type something, and then it can pull from any resource that it has access to and give you an answer. So that's the simplest way of describing an open AI. A closed AI is where you can control what it's going to pull its information from. So two of the examples I can think of is Notebook LM is one of them, and then Gen AI has that capability as well that you can access through the DOW right now. So what you do is you take the resources you want the AI to look at, you put it in there, you download it, upload it, and then you ask a question and it will only search those documents or resources that you've given it access to. I prefer the closed AI because I can control where the AI is getting its information from. I'm not worried it's pulling something that's completely outdated or wrong or who knows where it's coming from. So that's how I've found AI most useful, is when I can find some of the resources, but then have AI look through it for me, help me compare, like, okay, compare these two sections, what has changed, especially with the RFO.
Yeah, and I do think that is right now, because of the rapid changes that we're experiencing, I think it's nearly impossible because, again, acquisition.gov is a foundational resource. And it still has the FAR, which if your agency has adopted a deviation with the RFO, it's not, it wouldn't necessarily be currently accurate. So I do think that is sometimes, right, you always have to navigate risk versus reward in terms of utilization of AI tools. And so I think the tools themselves continue to evolve, and the utility in that sense continues to evolve as well. I think sometimes what I've noticed from our contract practitioners, our acquisitions professionals, is they can utilize, and obviously also keeping in mind that you're not putting procurement sensitive information into a system that can't hold that and complying with all regulatory requirements there. But sometimes people use the tools to effectively red team as well. So you can use an AI tool to see where maybe a justification and approval, in particular if you can scrub out any information that you couldn't upload, might be able to point out where there are gaps in that. And I think that's a unique way. So that goes a little bit beyond research, but certainly we're seeing a vast array of different opportunities to utilize AI. I have used it for research, and I walk through this in a fiscal law research class that I teach to our officer basic course here at the JAG School, where, again, depending on what information you're asking it to look for, it did give me 2 different answers. And I think that also highlights the importance of prompt engineering, right? The questions that we ask and making sure that the way that we ask those questions are done very specifically to elicit the answer that we're actually looking for. And so I think we all have some learning to do on that. How about you? Have you?
Well, I think I've used closed AI and open AI. I think for something like red teaming or just trying to gather information, open AI can be useful, but you just have to fact check it because at least the more transparent open AI platforms will show you the citations. And so you can go to those sources and pull the information. I think red teaming is a great idea using open AI, but I also like the idea of closed AI. If you upload the acquisition attorney's Deskbook and the Fiscal Law Deskbook into a closed AI system, that's an even quicker way maybe to search and find and get step 1 in terms of an analytical answer to your question.
Because you can upload websites. So sometimes I'll upload the actual FAR part from acquisition.gov and the RFO one into the same one. I can ask the questions about what's changed, how has it changed, and just try and learn that, especially as we have to teach a lot of times. So sometimes we really have to understand it to be able to teach it. So that's been helpful. So yes, we're in a situation where we're not dealing right now with PIA, but I can see how at least getting you started to understand the rules to then apply it to your specific contract. That is one way you can use AI.
Yeah, and the only caution I would have is be careful what you're uploading.
Very careful.
To an open AI source. Your contract is not something you're going to be able to upload unless you redact any kind of personally identifiable information or any kind of trade secrets, intellectual property, identity, address, all kinds of information you would need to take out before you could upload anything like that. You maybe really just like the generic contract provisions in your contract just to make sure you haven't forgotten something or you're not missing something.
Yeah, absolutely. Make sure you're following any agency policies. And, the Army JAG Corps, for example, has a policy out encouraging use, but also putting some parameters on that use to ensure that we're applying all the appropriate safeguards.
Yeah.
One reference that we didn't mention yet is WAR-U. So formerly known, the artist formerly known as DAU. So what about that? How do you find that helpful in contract law research?
I really used it at the beginning when I was trying to learn. So that is probably where I went in. I learned some specifics about certain areas. I'd watch the class or take the class on specific areas, especially when I would first get to an office when I had a little bit more free time before all the responsibilities fell down on me. So that was where I found it the most useful, is probably when I was just new to the contracts and fiscal law world.
Yeah, I kind of think of this, and because I committed the faux pas of using acronyms without saying them, it's Warfighting Acquisition University. It used to be Defense Acquisition University. I think of this kind of like some of the Congressional Research Service primers, right? If there's a topic that you're reading the FAR and it seems like a lot of words to you, right? You can go through, they offer classes. They also have live webinars, some of those hosted by attorneys. So you can also attend those. You'll see a lot of your acquisitions professionals getting, as part of their course plan, for example, professional development, they'll attend those. But they offer a lot of quick and easy Cliff Note version references that I think are especially helpful. So it is not a primary source, but especially if you're new to the area of contract law, an excellent starting point for understanding different topics.
If I knew there was an area that I just wasn't familiar with, like I was not familiar with like small business and commercial products, I went and watched a few classes on that just to get up to speed because I knew I was going to be covering down for a small office that did those style of contracts.
And I think you buried one other great resource there, which is Congressional Research Service. There can be some great papers on legal topics related to acquisitions policy, right? You may not get your FAR provision in there, but if you want to know sort of the legislative history or, how things are progressing, CRS does a great job of publishing information papers, and they update them very frequently. So they're an incredible sort of background research, secondary source, obviously, but can be very helpful.
They do a really good job, too. If something is out of date, it says it very quickly. They update that. So you'll know when I was doing research for my own paper on the Buy American Act, it was things got outdated because for about like 6 years there was a new law on the Buy American Act every year. So it told you, okay, this is partially, no good. So it was very good on that.
Well, I know that we've covered a lot of stuff here.
Oh, yes.
But, if you think about it, the job of being a lawyer is three things: research, analysis, and advice, right? And we're not telling you how to advise your client. And most continuing legal education is focused on the analysis, but the research is foundational, right? If you don't know what the law is, you can't analyze it. You can't apply it to the facts. And so I do think thinking through how you're going to do your research and looking at all of the available sources, not only to make sure that you have the law right, but to give you the bigger picture understanding so that you have that margin of knowledge that's really going to deliver value to your clients when you are analyzing and when you're giving that advice. So don't forget that step one is research. There are a lot of websites, there are a lot of government sources, but this is foundational to being an attorney, and especially a contract or acquisition attorney in 2026 when the law is changing so rapidly.
Absolutely. And also don't forget that if you're new to the area and you find a phenomenal resource, don't think that just because you're newer to the practice area that some of the attorneys that you're working with that have been doing it for decades must already know about that. Always utilize it as an opportunity to share knowledge too, because that definitely, especially in our ever-changing world, sometimes you might be the first person to find something.
With everything changing, it's always important. Don't gatekeep the information, share it.
And ask your colleagues. I mean, we didn't include that, but unless you're a team of one, which is actually quite possible if you're a uniformed attorney, you often have other colleagues, whether they're available in person or available, remotely. I would say don't ever be afraid to ask a question. You don't want to get something wrong in a contract or in a legal brief that someone else knew and you just didn't want to bother someone or take their time.
My best resource sometimes was the KO.
Yeah.
The contracting officer. I would ask them. They know the FAR. I loved asking. And they loved answering the questions, especially when I was new because they were trying to help me. All right. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today to go over all of this. Hopefully this was a very helpful episode, just trying to orient you on all of the resources out there as things are changing rapidly right now. Thank you for joining us today in this episode of The FAR and Beyond. Please make sure to follow us and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. We love to hear from our listeners. Please continue to reach out to us on Facebook and LinkedIn. The information can be found in the show notes from today's episodes. We will have every link that we talked about in the show notes today. The views expressed today are those of the presenters, not that the Judge Advocate General Corps, the Department of the Army, Department of the Air Force, or the Department of War.